when you are not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in colloquy with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. All right, first item on the agenda is citizens' comments. I do not see any hands raised. So we will move on to the second item of the agenda, which is Mr. Mangiarotti speaking to us about one-time expenses that have been incurred relative to this year's budget for us to consider possibly using some free cash to cover, considering our budget negotiations with ALG. Hello, Mr. Mangiarotti.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us.
Sure, thanks for inviting me. As a follow-up to the conversation we had last Thursday morning about the proposed use of reserves to fund a portion of the expenses that we're planning for FY22, I wanted to just come to the Finance Committee just to report back on some other expenses that we've incurred in responding to the COVID pandemic over the last year. That, much like some health insurance costs, which we're not able to find a way to get them reimbursed, there are other items that we had to handle that we're still trying to get reimbursed, but as of yet have not been able to. And I thought it'd be helpful just to bring a few of those to the Finance Committee's attention. The goal has always been to maximize that resource, and we've been doing that everywhere we can. In the budget that I presented last Monday to the Board of Selectmen, I reported that we have approximately $490,000 remaining from our CARES Act allocation, and we expect that will be used throughout this year to continue to respond to the pandemic in various ways, which I'm sure you're all aware. Interestingly, at the federal level, there's talk of a new relief plan, which I think could be approved as soon as tomorrow, depending on what happens when it gets back to the House. They may even be looking at it right now. But that has a substantial amount of funding that would make its way down to Acton, which is good news. And some of the restrictions that were in the first allotment of funding through the CARES program, we're starting to understand those, it may not be as restrictive as that. So of course we'll wait till it's finalized, hopefully tomorrow, before we can report exactly what that means. But it does mean that there's a potential for some additional support. And one area in particular that I wanted to mention as part of my comments tonight is that you keep seeing in the federal reports, infrastructure. They're going to give relief to a lot of people, but in the end, there's always a conversation about investing in infrastructure. And I think that's important for us and for me and for our team to really focus on, because we've been trying to put together many design projects for infrastructure plans that we have over the next few years to try to advance them along in anticipation that something like this might happen. So if you remember in whenever that was, in 2008 or 9, they put out a bunch of money for American Reinvestment Recovery Act. And if we had shovel-ready projects, we'd get an opportunity to get those funded. So I think it's important that with this budget that we're talking about, that we continue to invest in design projects like River Street Dam, Acton Center construction, High Street, Powder Mill Corridor, Kelly's Corner, wastewater and sewer, all those things, so that if we can advance projects to a good state of a design, and there's money that becomes available, we can go after it. So I'm really excited about that portion of the federal relief package, in addition to all the other things that may help. I even heard that they may consider revenue refilling, replacement. Yeah, that may be part of it, which is interesting. But onto the CARES package, and so over the last year, we've purchased things. We've purchased a lot of technology for these meetings like this, and for all of our staff to work remotely. Most of that stuff has been covered. Some of it hasn't, but we're still working on that. A lot of PPE, a lot of cleaning supplies, a lot of services related to keeping our buildings and facilities cleaner. Testing, we've done a lot of testing. Most of that's covered. Building improvements is an area that we had a lot of needs and ideas to make improvements. Unfortunately, the CARES Act capped building improvements at 150,000, and so we did a lot of improvements to our public facilities to introduce fresh air, to make it safer for employees to be there, and so we overhauled HVAC systems at the library, the public safety facility, town hall, and many of our other buildings as well. So we got up against that cap of 150 pretty quickly. So there's costs that we incurred for building improvements beyond 150 that we had to absorb within the operating budget or the other ways. Other examples of that are access control that we implemented at fire stations to try to, normally, traditionally our fire stations have sort of been open and we invited people to stop by and so forth. But we had to sort of change our approach over the pandemic, so we had to change a lot of the way the facilities are secured, and those costs weren't covered. So those start to add up. Other things were overtime. So one of the things that we did, I think, might have been the first week or maybe at least the first month, is we increased the hours at the transfer station. Instead of running 5 days, we actually added a 6th day to try to give people more time to spread out so that they're not waiting in line and not on top of each other. And we've maintained that 6th day throughout the year. That we're trying to get reimbursed, but as of yet have not. Police and fire and dispatch. So when town hall employees are out sick, if they got COVID or if they had to quarantine because their family were by COVID, they were out and work wasn't able to be completed and they weren't able to report to duty. But when police, fire, and dispatch can't come in, we actually have to bring people in on overtime to fill their shifts. So those costs weren't covered either. So the cost of having people out when they were sick or if they were in quarantine, and then the overtime that we had to use to fill them back in, those as of yet haven't been entirely covered. Portions of those have been, and we're still working it, but those are another example of things that weren't covered. Let's see, what else do I have? That's generally it. And again, for example, a big change happened a month ago. With the CARES Act, we were carrying 25% of all of the FEMA eligible expenses to be reimbursed through that. But then the Biden administration changed it, I think maybe right in their first week, that now anything that we can send to FEMA, we actually get 100% coverage for, which will actually free up a little bit of capacity in our CARES allocation, which is good news. So a lot of the vaccination, we've run 6 clinics, and the vaccines themselves are provided to us for free, but all the logistics and supplies and materials and staffing associated with that is not covered. So we're charging that to FEMA, and that should be entirely covered for as well. So those are just a few things just to share with the group as you're considering to consider how this one-time event has impacted the organization.
Christine.
And just to put this a little bit in perspective, when we were at ALG and we discussed the FinCom's position about how much we wanted to spend out of reserves that would bring us down to our 3% floor, we mentioned...
You mean free cash?
Free cash, sorry. Free cash, yes. We mentioned, Steve's point that there was about $200,000 worth of healthcare costs that couldn't have been predicted, couldn't have been managed for, and so we sort of gave a buy on $200,000 going below our 3% floor, hoping the rest would be covered by stabilization money. There's pushback on use of stabilization money, which we're going to have a discussion with Board of Selectmen about later in this meeting. But Mr. Mangiarotti wanted to just come to us and thought that there were other things that sounded like, the healthcare issue that we might want to consider when we're looking at how we would like the budget to be funded. So that's all, just putting that in perspective.
Specifically, these are arguably the emergency expenses that we have reserves for. They would not have come up if we had not been in this state of emergency. Jason.
I'm sorry, I must have missed it. What are the actual numbers? You talked about overtime not being reimbursed at the transfer station, police and fire dispatch. access controls, the over and above of the building improvements at 150K, what's the amount of money that we're talking about?
Thank you. So those costs are still being incurred on a regular basis, but generally, transfer station is around 35,000. OT for fire and police is around, the dispatch is close to 90,000. The building improvements, again, we got up against that capital 150, and I think we had spent closer to 300 on buildings, so that's around 150. And there are other things that we were going to do that we haven't moved forward on because of that cap. What other items? Need a number?
So we're talking ballpark 285, $300,000. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, generally, those are just the things that I came up with this afternoon. And again, we are trying to get reimbursement for some of those items any way that we can, but we have not as of yet.
Definitely encourage the going back and seeing what changes with the new Biden $1.9 trillion plan, and also seeing what gets freed up through FEMA. That's all highly encouraged and great news. Thank you for doing that. But so we're looking at about $300,000 of unexpected one-time incursions this last year that has an impact on the rest of your budget, which you had to take from other entities during the course of the year, correct?
Yeah, so the spending freeze and the hiring freeze freed up resources, which we were able to reallocate to these needs.
At this time, there's no risk of running out of money in time by July 1st, right?
Running out of money from just in general or from CARES, or both?
Both.
The answer is neither. Yeah, I'm not worried about either of those things.
Just had to ask. Thank you.
Okay.
Steve.
You're muted, Steve.
You're on mute.
Okay, maybe you can hear me now. So, John, the items you were just talking about are impacting fiscal 21. Am I correct? Like the current situation, or do they have spillovers in the fiscal 22?
No, I think it's 20 and 21 that those expenses are incurred. We haven't, there are things, as I said, that we would like to do, but that we haven't done yet. But no, nothing would impact 22.
So when we're talking about fiscal 22 beginning July 1, where, dare I say, maybe these things will not be so serious. But who knows? So in terms of reserve use in the fiscal 22 plan, I know from being on the health insurance trust that we had to increase our rates for next year by 2% just to cover excess COVID costs. And that's $200,000 between the town and the schools. Can you think of anything that you're sure is going to affect next year or after July?
Related to the COVID pandemic?
Yeah.
Not in the same way that all the things I just described affected our budget, but
Okay. How do you think we'll come in on this fiscal year? I mean, I know it's too early to make a prediction, but
we're gonna have a turn back based on the resources that we have not expended due to spending hiring free. It would be, I think last year was a substantial turn back. I don't know that we'll match that, but I think we will have more than normal, at least more than my normal.
that's good. That's a good job. given all you've had to deal with.
Thank you.
That said, John, there are things that would have otherwise been done with this money, correct? There are things that will need to happen later, presumably, that have not, because you've had to spend the money on this.
A lot of the spending, a lot of the budget resources free up are from staffing. So we had positions that were held over and unfilled from March up until, for the rest of 20 and for at least the first half of 21. So even if we've started to fill some of those positions now, it's halfway through the year. And so the savings has already been set aside from not spending at the first half of the year. So
I'm sorry, I meant relative to the expenses incurred while they were one time for this. Since we're looking at the next budget year out, these are things we would need to then pay to do in the next year. It's not like these are, we spent money on COVID-related expenses, which used money that would have happened for other things, you're saying, such as for staff, and those things still need to happen going forward.
Right. If we had to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in things like we did this year, we wouldn't be able to do that. Because we want to bring staffing back to a level that supports the services that we provide.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
1 second here. David Martin and John Benson are now joining us to give us an informal view of their feelings about the potential use of the stabilization fund. At the ALG meeting, there was a very strong negative response from the Board of Selectmen members present about the idea of using stabilization fund for some of this to cover some of the reserve expenses currently in the budget. So, David, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I would be. I'm happy to let David start because I understood he was to be the lead speaker tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would be very reluctant to dip into the stabilization fund. We some years back. I mean, I was at the town meeting at the time, but it was a long time ago. This fund was sold to town meeting as a rainy day fund and a capital fund.
David,
sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you just fine. That's you, John.
I'll continue, I guess. And to me, a rainy day means kind of a flood, not just cloudy with a little wind. And because it's something that is that we have to make up for. And the capital, I think that was intended was a medium-sized capital fund, and by that I mean it was not intended to pay for police cruisers and not intended to pay for fire stations, but something in between, especially things that were unexpected, like a failed roof or a failed HVAC system, or maybe needing to repave the parking lot of town hall, something like that. Again, I think it's not right to use this fund for as a free cash level 2, where we transfer money in and out of this fund every year. I think we lose the fact that we cross this line. And, if we're transferring money in and out all the time, we lose the fact that the noteworthy step of crossing over this line and dipping in to the stabilization fund. And FinCom has noted many times, especially Steve Noon has noted that recessions hit us in years 2 and 3. And, I don't think it's prudent to dip into the stabilization fund at the end of year 1 of the current recession. So what might we do about that? First, I think it's I completely agree with the free cash guidelines that you guys came up with, the 3 to 5% of the entire budget window. But I think that it's very difficult to hit that, right? We turn back something in a typical year, something between 0.5% of to 1.5% of the entire budget, and we have to fit it, aim our dart to hit it in that 2% window. Either that, or if we don't hit it just right, we've hit one boundary or another. And so I think that the practical problem is, what do we do there? John Peterson suggested that we estimate what the turn back would be. To me, that's well. First of all, you guys have expressed your reluctance in, counting your chickens before they hatch, kind of thing. But also, I think that's more difficult to do in a typical year, where we'd be estimating that turn back in early January for the end of the fiscal year, in late June. This year, actually, we're closer to the end of the fiscal year, and it's already a little bit, the town manager gave us a sense, and we're 4 months out to the end of the fiscal year. But in the beginning of January, in a normal year, we have town meeting in the beginning of April. That's almost 6 months ahead, and that's a very difficult thing to estimate. I don't have a magic solution for this. One of the things that occurred to me, just as a suggestion, is to broaden the window for budget purposes, but never for reality, right? So when you're, if that makes sense, so you for budgeting purposes, you might broaden the window. I'll just throw out like 2.5% to 5.5%, something like that, which gives you a bigger window to aim the dart into. And then after free cash is certified, in the next fiscal year, if we've missed the target, then if we've gone below the 3%, maybe then we dip into the stabilization fund and say, that's kind of evidence of a rainy day, if you will, that the turn back was not our typical turn back, and so we came in low, and maybe we make up for it in a fall town meeting. Or if we go above the high end, maybe we choose that time to replenish the stabilization fund if we have drawn it down previously. So that's just one thing that occurred to me, but like I said in the beginning, there's a reluctance to treat this, at least on my part, and several other members of the board have also expressed things as something similar to free cash, where we transfer in and out every year.
Thank you, David. I want to be clear that there has not been a formal vote by the Board of Selectmen about it. I just, in case there was any confusion for anyone listening, this was just that at the ALG meeting, David specifically spoke as a private citizen about his concerns about this. Let's go ahead. Christine, I think, had her hand up first.
Thank you, David. So first of all, I don't think there was any discussion on our part about dipping in and out of the stabilization fund. It was our hope that the town would budget to the 3% floor and only spend reserves above that 3% floor. We spent a lot of time working on our reserve policy because at the beginning of the year, we actually had the notion of spending reserves down much lower to give tax relief to the citizens. And through long discussions with, John Mangiarotti and the finance department and our own digging around, we determined that fiscal health for the town is a free cash number, and it's a free cash number at 3% or above, and that's kind of how we hit that target. And if I've got 2 buckets of money, and one of them I take from and it doesn't impact our fiscal standing, and one of them it does, I still have the same amount of money at the end of the day, no matter which one I spent it out of. So I still don't quite understand the desire to hold tight to the stabilization fund as opposed to having that same amount of money in free cash where it better serves us in our financial rating, in our fiscal rating.
Did you want to respond, David?
The only thing I would say is I perfectly get if you want to play it conservative and when we set up the budget to not go below the 3%, not counting any turnbacks. But I would say again that window is pretty narrow, and then that makes it quite likely that you're going to go above the upper limit, and then you have too much money. I mean, that's a terrible problem. But still, it's outside your guidelines. And I said the reasons why I don't think we should dip into the stabilization fund.
Just to highlight something Christine said, the 3% floor is actually the bottom level in that we found out of the various municipal guidances on best practices for where free cash should be. So that's how we got to that 3% number. We will be very excited someday to be talking about getting close to the 5% ceiling, but sadly we're not there right now. I think I saw Jason next.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. As for the recommendation from John Peterson about estimating the turnback, I'd be happy to let you estimate the turnback because if you have a couple of years in a row of being right on your estimates, that would engender trust and allows for greater latitude for using funds on spec during the budgeting process. Without that track record of, and yes, Mr. Mangiaretti's done great for the last 2 years in meeting and exceeding the turnbacks. 2 years is awesome. I'd love to see 5, 6, 7. But without that track record and without a history of estimating, close enough, no, I'm not comfortable broadening the window during the budgetary cycle. Do want to echo what Christine said. We were explicitly told that we cannot blend all the sources of funds to count as the blanket term of reserves. So if that's the case, then we absolutely cannot go down below the 3% limit, even in the budgetary cycle. I also want to echo something that Steve Noon said years and years ago, which is that on a bottom line budget, once you encumber the funds and say that they can be used in a bottom line budget by the town manager, you are taking it on trust that you're going to get that turn back. And I'm just not that trusting. No, I'm not comfortable going below 2.5. I do agree with you, Selectman Martin, about that the stabilization fund was built for large purchases. I just got for the first time last week the 10-year capital improvement plan. That's going to eat through a fair chunk of the stabilization fund. I'd be fine with using stabilization fund for long-term capital things that are truly, one-time or once-in-a-lifetime thing. Not fire trucks, not police cars, but large buildings that are going to outlast all of our living in Acton. And then finally, if you just look at what we just heard about there being $300,000 in unexpected expenses this year that fortunately the town manager was able to recoup elsewhere, that's a fairly large number. And so if we're not supposed to go below the 3% limit as per statewide recommendations, and we're already proposing to go beyond that limit with where we are now with the current ALG plan, and there is still risk to maybe not getting as much CARES reimbursement as we want, et cetera, then we're shaving this thing down very heavily. I'm not comfortable in automatically going below our floor right from the start. If there is no recourse to take out of stabilization, and by the way, I understand the stabilization is a harder sell at town meeting, which is a good thing, because it requires a 2/3 vote, then the only resultant thing to do is to figure out where else to cut. And so our recommendation, well, I shouldn't say our, but our policy would lead to the conclusion that other expenses have to be cut elsewhere. or you're going to have to dip into stabilization. But you can't take it from free cash. Not if we're not allowed to count all the buckets as reserves.
Roland? I'm sorry, David, did you want to respond to that?
No,
at all?
nothing there. Thank you.
Roland?
Talk about the stabilization fund and, use it for big items, and all of a sudden now we have, we have a rainy day and the recession and everything else, and we just have to put in $150,000 into HVAC because we need to reconfigure to bring in fresher air, etc. That's a one-time expense that perfectly fits with stabilization. Because it was an unexpected expense. If we weren't in this pandemic, we wouldn't be in the situation. We wouldn't have needed to do anything. So that's where I kind of see where stabilization fits in perfectly to use. I don't want to see us 10, 15, 20 years down the road going, wow, we put the stabilization fund in, and I don't know what year it was right now. I remember being at town meeting and going over that, and we put the money in stabilization, and we never used it. Which means that at that point would be a poor use of taxpayer funds. It doesn't go well on either the Board of Selectmen, the Select Board, or the Finance Committee, or the town management. That's kind of where I stand. I just don't want to see it sit there forever and we never use this thing and we scold to the town citizens. I mean, that's one of my concerns. So, it was money that was taxed. We paid for it. It's sitting there. At some point, it's a prudent discussion to have that funds should be used for what their intended purposes were.
David?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would feel better about drawing from the stabilization fund if we drew from it for particular purposes like that. So if we had to spend this past year $300,000 on HVAC systems, only of which half of that is reimbursable by the CARES Act, it would make sense to me to draw $150,000 from the stabilization fund. Maybe there are other things like that, I don't know. But I agree with what Roland's saying.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so for everybody's benefit, it was 2016, it was Article 6 of the annual town meeting warrant, and it was established as a capital stabilization fund only. There's nothing in the motion of the warrant article about rainy day funds. So my question is, the reserve use for FY22 that we have, what is it comprised of? There's a number, it's adding up some items.
If you look at the $725,000-ish, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number in front of me. Line
1,000.
Free cash usage from the town's budget is for capital, and on the ALG spreadsheet, that entire 1.15 million is designated as being only for capital expenses.
So if it's only for capital, and there's no rainy day, expense in there, then to me it is entirely appropriate to draw it from a capital stabilization fund. That is what it's for, to fund capital projects. It's not there to backstop spending overages or problems with pandemics and expenses like that. But it is there to fund capital. And as long as that's the only thing we intend to use it for in FY22, I think that is entirely appropriate.
I want to make sure I'm understanding that entirely. As I read the ALG spreadsheet now, and from previous things I believe I've heard the town manager say, the use of any form of reserves, free cash, or stabilization fund is currently allocated to capital. So it's all, if they're talking about spending reserves, they're talking about capital.
Well, if that's correct, then I don't see what we're talking about, because that's what it's there for. That's why we established it at the 2016 town meeting, because at the time we didn't have a neat 10-year capital plan like we just saw. We were just beginning to talk about that stuff. 2016 was right after the 2015 facilities assessment that was done by consultants that told us how poor most of our public structure were, and how much we were looking at spending over the next 20 years to replace them. And we identified as top priorities: the senior center and North Acton Fire Station, the DPW building, and upgrades to the existing fire stations. Now, the senior center has been taken care of. The North Acton Fire Station is under construction, and the new plan, I see the DPW building, and it doesn't seem to address the other fire stations. But all I'm saying is it was established for this purpose. If you go back even further, we had a fund called Neswick, which was money that came from the not having to close down the transfer station, costs that might have been incurred for environmental concerns. And we had put together, over the years, we put aside nearly $5 million into that reserve. And then it was determined that we had no liability. And we designated it for capital. And we pulled each year's capital spending out of the Neswick fund until it was pretty well exhausted. And then we petitioned the state, I think, to basically convert it to free cash when the capital needs were expended. So as long as we're not proposing to pull money out of the stabilization fund for operating expenses, then I don't see that there's a big issue with using it for capital.
But I think the issue is that the Board of Selectmen disagree with us.
Well, after I just explained it, I'm sure they won't agree with us now.
Of course.
David.
So yeah, I agree with that. It like it's very similar to what Roland said, and it makes me feel better when we're talking about that. But I think it has to be the intent of this is right-sized capital. Frankly, for a fire station or something of that size, I can't see us laying away $11 million or something like that. Over. I mean, we would never do that. But we would lay away stuff for maybe for a ladder truck, or to repair a roof, or some other kinds of capital projects that take funds measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe into small millions of dollars, but also not tens of thousands of dollars. Like I said, I mean, I feel uncomfortable using this for I would call it the normal capital expenses that you don't have to lay away for, like a couple new police cruisers each year, or whatever, replacing one of the town's dump trucks, things like that. I think that's not what this fund was intended for.
That said, there are some of those items in the budget as it currently stands. Some of them I suspect we are borrowing for, but the Kelly's Corner pedestrian lights we need to purchase currently add up to close to $1 million. We can reallocate some other funds to get that closer to $500,000, but we certainly have some money in there for capital projects that we could argue of the scale you're talking about that we could argue could be paid for out of the stabilization fund. I'm just hoping we can get on the page where we understand each other at this point relative to stabilization fund usage. Adam, and then Sahana.
Yeah, I mean, as a citizen taxpayer, that stabilization fund belongs to the taxpayers. And as a taxpayer, if I was given the choice between spending down that stabilization fund on capital needs in 21, 22 versus having a tax override, I would vote to spend down the stabilization fund. And as a FinCom member, I would make the same recommendation.
No one's talking overrides though. Sahana.
And
Hmm.
no, I think nobody has the stomach for an override. Please no.
Sahana.
I agree with all of you on this. My question to David, David, do you know what that 700? I haven't really looked at it. I'm sure if any one of you can tell me what that $780,000 is for the capital improvements plan, that would kind of help too right now. So do you know what it is?
Madam Chair, may I respond?
Yes, please do.
So I'm sorry, Sana. I don't have the capital plan in front of me right now. You know, my concern about this the use of the stabilization fund was what I called it, using as free cash level 2, basically stopping the use of free cash at 3% and then taking the remainder out of the stabilization fund. You know, I'm much more comfortable saying this thing that costs $150,000 and this thing that costs $200,000 we're taking out of stabilization, the rest we're taking out of free cash. That just makes me more comfortable. You know, I can't speak for anybody else. And there are a number of different items in the capital budget for next year. I just don't have them in front of me.
So when we're talking about stabilization fund, when we go to town meeting and say this is what we want, instead of having a majority vote, this would have to be a 2/3 vote, right? Okay, just making clear. Thanks.
Christine.
So David, would you be comfortable if we asked for the payment of the streetlights for the Kelly's Corner project to come out of stabilization?
You know, I'd have to think about that a little bit, but that is a reasonable idea to me. I mean, you know, I'd have to go through the numbers and see for myself how much is left in free cash. If that's $500,000. Wait, or someone, Christy had said $500,000 out of the million.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think that the idea was to borrow part of it, but this is going back a bit in my memory. I don't think you can pull $500,000 out of the town budget to pay for that one thing.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
May I just say one other thing? I mean, I would be comfortable with anything that we can go to town meeting and explain succinctly, right? That we're taking, you know, I'll just, you know, like I said, $150,000 for HVAC, if that's the proposal, and then some other amount of money, or some hundreds of $1,000s for the lighting, that also would be fine. That's an easy thing for town meeting to judge and look at and, you know, make a determination.
Steve.
Yes, I think the best way to handle this is we need to make up a list of what's in the 750, or whatever the number is. What items we feel we need to go over the existing revenue projections to still do, and you know, to the extent they are long-lived capital type assets, then I think a case can be made for taking them out of the stabilization fund. To the extent they are more operating in nature, or as Dave was saying, police cruiser, or you know, something like that, then it should be handled the way it normally has been in the operating budget. You know, we have ways of funding ambulances out of the ambulance enterprise fund. You know, we have mechanisms for funding vehicles, yeah, but fire engines sometimes are a little pricey at $700,000-800,000 a copy. And there's a few other large pieces of equipment that we have to buy from time to time. So I think that the next step is just ask the town staff to give us a list of what they think would be appropriate to take out of reserves. And those that are capital in nature, we should take out of stabilization, and those that are not, we should take out of free cash to the extent, you know, we can and still live within our policy. And if there's something left, then we need to have a discussion. But right now, the only exception I'm willing to make on free cash has been the money that I know the health insurance trust is going to have to charge for COVID. But there could be others.
Jason, are you expanding on that, or can we spend a second to talk about what Steve just did?
I'm expanding on this.
Okay, go ahead.
So on page 21 of the town manager's proposed budget, there is a chart that has two lines for capital borrowing and capital free cash, which comes to $793,997. So I believe our ask of the town is, of that $794,000, we want to see it broken out into two buckets. One, true long-term capital. Two, more or less operating costs. To the extent that the items in the long-term capital meet the 2/3 threshold to make it to at town meeting to pass through stabilization, so be it. And of the remaining money that is deemed to be short-term capital, as Steve just said, let's give them the exact number that they can get to our 3% floor. And if there is something that doesn't fit, then we would respectfully ask to go back and find cost savings elsewhere, because we're not going to violate the bottom of the floor. Am I, with the caveat that the 3% floor is going to have the $200,000 taken out for the health insurance trust, as Steve Noon just said. We can write this down with hard numbers, and then please make the recommendation that the Board of Selectmen match that. Is that accurate? Did I capture everything, at least from a formulaic perspective? Did I capture everything?
If you could write that down, that would help me. I was trying to write notes and got a little lost in the middle. Steve, please go ahead.
Did I get it right, Steve?
Yeah, that's where I was heading with this.
I'll write it up now.
What we don't want to do is exactly where Dave started this conversation, is we don't want to create a rainy day fund out of the stabilization fund. If we're going to use it, we need a reason to use it. And it has to be an appropriate level of or a type of expenditure that is appropriate for a capitalization fund. Like I said, if you go back and read that warrant or that motion, the town meeting approved a capital stabilization fund. It did not approve a slush fund, rainy day fund, or anything else. And Dave, to your point, it was never intended to be a savings account for building buildings, but it was meant to put money aside more regularly than we have. We haven't really transferred money into it as we probably should have, but to pay for things, and including paying for financing for bigger pieces of acquisition. So, but that's my take on it. I was there at the time. I was part of that discussion. So my memory is not what it used to be. So, but yeah, it was never intended to fund cruisers.
Christine?
Actually, David, go ahead and respond before I jump in.
No, I lost my. I'm really sorry. You can go ahead.
What I was going to say is, so my belief in conversations at ALG with the town manager is that he's actually very positive about our policy, and feels that given some time, he could align with that in the way that he budgets for the town. And I bring this up to say that I agree, and I want us to find the capital items that we should charge to the stabilization fund. But unlike Jason, I might be more willing to consider going below our floor for this particular year, given the pandemic, and given that I personally believe that the town and the schools have given us some very conservative budgets. And I'm not sure where I see that I would need them to cut. But that's just my perspective on where we draw the line this year.
To add on to that, Mr. Mangiarotti pointed out at the last ALG meeting that while we had been talking about the use of reserves for a while, it was really partway through the town's budget planning process that we introduced our new policy, which was a significant, it increased the floor from our previous policy enough that it was not a small change. So we are in some ways asking them to deal with a brand new policy which they had not planned for. David.
I remember what I was going to say. So it's not just me that called this a rainy day fund. In fact, you guys have had discussions this year where you guys have called it a rainy day fund. In fact, you were talking about the fact that that the current situation is a good time because it's a rainy day to dip into the fund. So, but I understand that it's intended to as a capital stabilization fund, but we should also then talk about at some point how we replenish this fund, right? Under what circumstances we put stuff into the layaway fund, that's not something that we need to talk about tonight, but I think it's important to do that. If we're going to, I think an active capital stabilization fund is a really good idea, but we just have to decide how money comes in and out. We have so many per year, or some other circumstance that we put money in. Maybe if turnbacks are greater than expected, or I don't know what.
Steve and then Roland.
Okay, I'm just going to quibble with Dave. Yes, we've said this is the example of the rainy day. The problem with discussions on this topic is we use a global term, reserves, and when we do, people hear different things. Sometimes they hear free cash, sometimes they hear all reserves. Some people think stabilization funds are like free cash. So sometimes it's not so much what you say, it's how people hear it. And yeah, I'm sure I did say, hey, if we're ever going to use reserves, this is the year to do it. Because it's not just raining, it's pouring. But I, for one, would never make the mistake of classifying them the same.
Do we know how much there is sitting in stabilization right now?
2.1 million.
Roughly 2 million, I think. Yeah.
Is that your whole thing, Roland?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Do we all feel like we have a better understanding about specifically David's, but a general sentiment of the use of the stabilization fund and its need to be protected potentially? Jason.
So I just sent an email to the entire finance committee, which of course could be seen as an open meeting law violation. So I'm going to read it now so that we're on the same page. And I would ask for, if I may, Madam Chair, I would ask if you go around and see if I've captured the will of the committee on this. This is the formula that we just discussed tonight. Define 3% of the proposed FY22 budget. Subtract $200,000 as a set aside for health insurance trust. That is the final value which can be spent down to the next year, defined as floor. Take the capital requests as shown on page 21 of the town manager's budget for capital items that comes to approximately $794,000. Define the asks in that amount and put them into one of two buckets: true long-term capital expenditures and more short-term, dare I say, operating capital expenditures. And I already realized I made a mistake. The number in the town manager's budget, but I just said it wrong. It's 5, 6, 7. No, I had it right. 794. Good. All
Hold on,
items that are
Jason.
long-
You said our floor was, as I understood it, you said it was relative to the Acton budget. Do you mean the total Acton spending?
the proposed, the rules of the floor, the proposed total spend.
Okay.
The rules of the floor, defining the floor, carving out a $200,000 set aside for the health insurance trust. All items that are long-term capital expenditure will be held against the stabilization fund. All items that are operational capital expense can be spent down to the floor. Adjust the budget ask to ensure that the floor is not pierced. Did I capture it properly?
Captured what you proposed properly, yes.
Okay. How does everyone, if I may, Madam Chairwoman, how does everyone feel about it? And Mr. Martin, do you understand the proposal?
Go ahead, David.
I think I understand. I'm not. To me, it's more important to select the items that are appropriate to come out of stabilization, and do that, right? So I guess I come at it from a different way. I don't disagree that you by your guys' policy, and I understand that, is that you don't want to dip below 3% of total spend, or 3% minus $200,000 this year, the total spend, without considering any turnbacks from the current year, and that makes sense. And then we would need to put capital items, appropriate capital items somewhere else, towards at the stabilization, if we wanted to still do that. But also, that's just me, right? So
Yeah. You're not speaking for the board.
Right.
Steve.
Yeah, Jason, I think you captured what we were talking about. I think I want, when the first couple of steps are done, I still think I want another swing at it to see what's left, if there is such a remainder, and decide at that point, after we've done our best effort to identify the capital items, what we're talking about, and just take one more look at it before we, and I don't want to do it tonight, basically, until I know what the numbers actually look like and the items look like.
You're allowing for a shade of gray.
Well, the rest of our discussion is actually about this. For some reason, it feels to me like we've moved on to the next topic, which is about discussing our use of the stabilization fund relative to the budget. So thank you for joining us, Mr. Martin. And I'm going to switch you back to being an attendee, unless you have anything else to say to us right now.
Nope, nothing else.
Thank you for joining us. So, as you've heard, there's a strong negative reaction to using the stabilization fund, and we need to decide how we want to approach the next round of talking to ALG about the budget, which happens this Thursday. It's actually been moved to 5 p.m. Steve.
Maybe I'm a little dense tonight, but it sounds like it was more of a misunderstanding than a strong negative reaction. I don't see how anybody can argue with using a capital stabilization fund for capital. I can't see that. The town meeting voted clearly to establish it. And as long as it's used for the purpose established, I don't see where an objection could be. I'd be the first one to join the people objecting if I thought it was just going to be used as a slush fund for operating expenses. That would be wrong. But from what we just laid out, I don't say I can't see how anybody could disagree with it, because I've been around this town too long. But I don't see a good logical position for not using the stabilization fund to fund legitimate capital.
So just the first thing Dean Charter said was, we need this money for large unexpected things that happen, such as needing a new roof or the dam at River Street. Now, we came up against needing a new roof for the library, and I personally don't know how that was paid for, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't out of the stabilization fund.
Would you like me to tell you?
I would love to know.
It came out of the assessor's overlay reserve.
So basically another fund.
Another puddle of money is don't
Puddle of money.
Jason loves those. Christine.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that same thing, and that Dean gave an automatic pushback, and then John Benson gave an automatic hard no, and then David Martin, who was simply watching ALG, raised his hand and came on and gave an automatic no. And I appreciate that, having talked through it logically with David, he is willing to consider some use of the stabilization fund. It'll be interesting to see if a similar argument works for the entirety of the board, but we should be prepared for whatever scenario.
Roland.
What you guys said, what Dean Charter said, we have a problem with the Roost Street Jam, and we're going to need to fund that to get that, to remove that. So, stabilization fund it is. So he just said, it's what it's there for. Well, how long did it take him to do the library roof, Steve? It took, remember that first question at John Manager writing, we started as town manager, when is that going to be completed? We've been waiting on it for 3 years to get completed. So the town doesn't have a good track record in that regard of replacing roofs, based on the town library. And we may not have we're not going to replace the roof on town hall for many, many, many years to come. I'll be dead by the time that happens. So the roof was completed close to 2 years ago, as John just popped up in the chat, which is great. And he did a great job of getting that to fruition and get that completed. He inherited that issue that should have been done before he came on board, where it was promised 2 years prior. It's the same type of thing was with the library door. Oh, we're going to take care of that. And that was like in February. And that didn't happen until almost a year later. Just foreplanning in that regard. I think John's doing a much better job at that and getting us where we need to be. So I really feel that we have capital projects that are long-term in nature that we should be using that stabilization fund and look at roofs as more maintenance and figure out a timeline for saving money for that. And the stabilization fund is a perfect use of that. So if we know we're going to need to replace a roof on, say, a DPW building, we know it's going to be done within the next 5 years. We know it's going to cost roughly $1 million, say, for example. I'm just throwing out a number hypothetically. That we start saving $200,000 a year in the stabilization fund to take care of that. So when it comes up, we vote out a stabilization, and we have the money there to cover it. So we have the $2.1 million. We need to really start thinking about projects that money can start funding, start using. We've already been taxed for it.
Steve.
Okay, so the genesis of the stabilization fund, again, came about at a period of time when, and by the way, it was an idea that was first put forward by the FinCom. And it was put forward by the FinCom in the context of the FinCom saying, we need a long-term capital plan. And the reason why we said that was we didn't have one. And it prompted schools to do an assessment of their facilities. It prompted the town to do an assessment of their facilities. And it prompted us to put together a joint committee on capital, which died an unnatural death in the Superintendent Glenn Brand incident. Essentially all the members but me, I think, left town, left their jobs. Janet Adachi's still here, not on the selectmen anymore. So the context of this was from a long-term planning standpoint. So the idea of having a stabilization fund, and it's basically it was the first step in executing a long-term capital plan. We've never used it except to pull some money out once to buy a piece of land and then put the money back in. We've never used it at all for the intended purpose. So the idea is, yeah, you could use it to service debt for big ticket items. You could use it to buy big ticket one-time pieces of equipment. No, it's not for recurring stuff that you buy every couple of years, even if it is capital. So that was the intent to set it up. Now we finally, no disrespect meant to the town, I'm very happy that we have a capital improvement plan. The schools put together a similar plan maybe a year or two ago, but not quite as comprehensive in some respects. So now is not the time to start messing with the stabilization fund. It's there for a purpose. The purpose is to fund capital items. Every year we have some. There's no reason why we shouldn't start using it because we have the preconditions finally that we wanted. We have both entities having a long-term capital plan. So now is the time to start utilizing the vehicle we set up to finance long-term capital. And as long as the items that are proposed for FY22 fit the appropriate description, that's what it's there for. That's what we told the taxpayers we're going to do. To put $2 million aside and never use it, well, that's overtaxation. So the problem is we never had a plan to spend it. Now we have a plan. We ought to use it.
Here, here.
Mike.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. We have a history of creating funds like like this fund that sort of get transitioned into the twilight zone. You know, money comes in, never comes out again, and it just stays there. And it should be more functional. It should be, you know, with regard to what Roland said about like the dam, I would sort of disagree in the sense that if it's in the capital budget, then it gets repaired. If it's not in the capital budget, wait till next year and put it in the budget. But it shouldn't just be a default position that you just use the money in that fund. But you know, it's just with regard to what Steve was saying. It's you know, you create this fund, you should use it, but have it clearly defined purpose and you know what goes into it, and what comes out of it, so it just doesn't stay there forever, or we wind up with the little pools of money that they're talking about, like we just heard about from the assessor's office or whoever it was, their little secret stash. We got enough secret stashes. That's it.
Steve?
So I think the last couple of times, or at least my sense for this year and what was reported last year, was that while we did have good turnbacks, you know, it was very difficult. They were very difficult to come by. They were gained because we held back on the approved budget. We held back on hiring. We held back on, you know, whatever we could hold back on in order to give us healthy returns. And my concern about spending below our floor is that we can't guarantee the next couple of years won't require similar diligence in the budget process. You know, once we head to an upward swing where we start seeing greater turnbacks, greater revenues, you know, then we can reimagine how we budget with our reserves and reserve replenishments. And I'm just, balancing keeping a safety net egg and not counting on returns because they've been so difficult to come by. So I feel that as much as we can within the edicts of the Stabilization Fund for capital projects, especially this year, on that fund, that would definitely be my preference.
Sahana.
Like Adam said, I am totally in agreement with what Steve just explained to us. The thing is, before we make, we discuss more into all of this, I think it's a good idea to look at what those, the numbers and the breakdown on what we are using that, what's being proposed in the budget, the $780,000. I think that's where, let's look at it. It has to be a real capital improvement for a capital improvement project, and probably, we can have more discussions after we look at that.
I'm sorry, some information has not fully been transmitted here. There is a ballpark $225,000 shortfall between the gap that needs to be closed, rather, between revenues and the town school Minuteman, the total budget that we have to pay for. The proposal that Christine and I presented was figure out what is capital that can be paid to cover that out of the stabilization fund, and we will support that. Christine.
Yeah, sorry, it's $703,000. The way ALG has it, they list 1.15 million out of reserves.
Yeah.
And then an unfunded of 221,000. And we say not 1.1 million out of reserves, 468,000 out of reserves, a $200,000 allowance for healthcare, and that leaves us with 703,000. So from our point of view, that's the number we're trying to close the gap on, right? Is that
yes, yeah. So it's not the straight capital free cash numbers given in the town budget, in part because presumably some of that reserve would be allocated to being usable by the school or something. Budget also. So we need to figure out what we want to do about that. Our next ALG meeting is on Thursday. It is possible for us to say a number of things which involve not having come up with a conclusion by then. This is around the time of year where we would be coming to a consensus with everyone on the ALG plan, but we are not as far into understanding the town budget as we normally would be with the town meeting having been pushed back the way it has. So we're in a different position than usual. Go ahead, Steve.
So for the rest of us who don't go to ALG meetings, so 5 o'clock on Thursday, I don't know, I'll still be babysitting at 5 o'clock on Thursday. So what is the proposed reserve use? Is it 1150 or is it 750?
It's 1150 plus however someone's going to fill that to something. That's just
221.
Okay, so in rough numbers, we'd allow something over 3% of free cash, which would these days be 500,000.
Christine, you said that free cash above the floor plus
the free cash above the floor is 468,000. So then you do the $200,000 allowance. Now you're down to a $703,000 cap. So if they come back with 400,000 of capital, then.
So for argument's sake, if they came back with a fire engine, we'd be good. If they come back with 14 police cruisers, we wouldn't be good.
Put another way, I don't know that the Board of Selectmen would be good with them coming back with a fire engine. As I understand it, we're at the details point.
I'm not. I'm giving hypotheticals.
Go ahead. Sorry.
You know, there could be a combination of River Street Dam and, well, you know, to get to the 750,000, that could all be legitimate. So we really need to ask them how they would, what projects they would draw out of a stabilization fund, given what Jason just wrote up as our thoughts on the use of stabilization funds. I mean, they're not for rainy days. They're not a slush fund. They're to fund a long-term plan.
I'm sorry. Trying to write and think at the same time as telling you. One of the reasons Mr. Mangiarati came and spoke to us earlier was to present possible other reasons for us to consider drawing below the floor on free cash if we wanted to consider.
I understand, but the things John mentioned were 21 items, and we're discussing reserve use in 22, I believe.
What I was trying and failed to say is that some of those replaced some items that would have been spent in that budget that will then just get pushed into the fiscal year 22.
Again, if they're capital in nature, that's one thing. If they're largely delayed staffing.
Well, there's $150,000. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yep.
If what gets pushed to next year is just operating costs for staff, then that's not going to meet the strict criteria of what a capital stabilization fund is for. However, if there were building improvements, you know, that would.
What I was trying to say is, do we think any of those expenses would qualify as a reason for drawing some of the money from free cash, not stabilization fund?
Absolutely. I'd give it some thought. I never said that the health insurance premiums were the only thing that would be unreimbursed. But again, those will impact us in 22, not 21. So there's a time horizon issue in my mind. If we want to have a discussion of reserve use in FY22, then it has to be 22 items or potentially things that spill over.
I think that's the question of what would we consider having qualified as a spillover. Christine.
So, I mean, Jason's brought up holding firm to our floor, and I've brought up giving it some bend. I'd like to hear before we go into that meeting. So the town manager brought up $375,000 worth of bubble expenses outside of health insurance. If our $703,000 gap, you know, $375, we allow them to go on. We allow to take out a free cash in the balance. We're able to find true capital expenses that would come out of the stabilization fund. You know, just where is everybody on even the idea of that? Is it something that most of our members are open to?
Jason.
I'm open to spending money out of the stabilization fund for true capital items. I'm perhaps even more conservative than Steve. I'm not sure I'd grant the $200,000 for health insurance trust because we are talking about a finite set of globally pooled reserves. So if they need to pull out of the stabilization fund now, just remember that's that much less that they have to use for this 10-year capitalization plan that they have presented us with. We have a $700,000 problem. It's if we get lucky by categorizing a chunk of it as long-term capital and pulling out a stabilization fund, we are still drawing down our aggregate reserves. Might be fine for 1 year, but I go back to what we said at the beginning of the year, which is this is a year that we have to be very careful of what we decide to declare as a need versus a want. I would much prefer we find budget savings elsewhere. We've got a $700,000 problem. We can't do this 3 times. We're completely out. So my advice for going into ALG is, by all means, let's ask immediately. I'm glad to see that Manager Mangiarati is still on the line with us. Let's get an accounting of what those capital items are right away. Let's try and do some easing of the pain by putting it into the capitalization, into the stabilization fund. But other than that, no, we've got to find savings elsewhere. We have to cut down on the budget side because we still have a $700,000 problem, and that's not just going to go away.
Anyone else? Responses? Oh, John, please go ahead.
Oh, John, we still can't hear you. Must be
Sorry, how about now?
Yes.
Thanks for mentioning me. I thought I'd jump in. Thanks for the feedback initially on the capital improvement plan. It is a lot of content and data and represents a very high level of transparency. So I'm excited to talk to you more about it, and I can understand if people haven't gotten through the whole thing yet. But I just wanted to call your attention to one of the pages that I think would answer part of what you've been looking for, which is page 43, which is the breakdown of exactly what's proposed in FY22 that makes up the capital, recommended capital. It's 580,000 free cash project, 213,000 debt service for new borrowing, and then there's 439,000 of operating capital, which is how the total of capital that we're envisioning using in ALG plan equals over 1.1 million.
It doesn't say specifically what those items are, especially in that first 580K.
Yeah, I can read them to you, sure. But there's a list right in there, broken down by number.
Go ahead, Steve.
What page was it, John?
43.
43.
Okay.
Would we like John to read it to us?
Can you share the screen and show us that page, John? That would be easier.
So, I'm really excited about this capital improvement plan. It took about 6 months or maybe longer to put together, and I wanted to do a big presentation, which we're planning for March 29th. So I don't want to steal too much of our thunder from presenting to you all the work we did to put into this needs for not just for 22, but for the next 9 years. Many towns have a 5-year capital plan. I don't know too many that have a 10-year plan. So this is really a big deal that we were able to put this together, and it took a lot of work. And it puts together a really good roadmap for investments that we think we're going to need over the next 10 years with a direct recommendation for what we need to do 22. And then it's a living document that we can work with each year to update. So we're always having a long view, which I know the finance committee likes. So I think, I'd rather not share the screen. Like I said, I want to do a big show for you in 2 weeks. But I can fire through a couple of the projects if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Page 44, guys.
Yeah. So implement a diversity officer position, a heavy equipment brush chipper, net zero vehicle replacement program, complete streets and fire alarm systems, sustainability programs, forklift, public shade tree assessment program, replacing gas-powered extrication tools, technology upgrades, funding a vacant storefronts program, sidewalk maintenance and new construction. Those are the free cash projects for a total of 580. So just to talk about, I know the needs and wants and paring things down. Those projects I just listed represent about $1 million worth of requests, and I'm recommending we spend about $580,000 to accomplish those projects. So even though it seems like a big capital plan, there are several things that we've had to pare back to deliver a budget that we think meets the expectations of the town, and also continues to deliver the services.
Thank you. David, I don't think we're gonna take any more comments at this point in our discussion. Thank you. David Martin has his hand raised. Questions, anyone? Thoughts? With y'all on mute, I'm hearing crickets here. Christine.
I'm reading the list.
Sorry. I'm looking at the list too, and I am concerned simply because David explicitly called out things like a police car. And I'm not sure that any of these are going to hit his particular feelings about what should qualify for stabilization. But I think anything that's capital should qualify for stabilization fund use.
Well, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, I am happy to go through this list tomorrow. So,
ALG's meeting actually has just moved. We don't know when, but
well, then I won't do it tomorrow.
you have some time.
But since I was part of the original capital planning group, I do have some documents that help define capital from operating that I can review, and I can go through this list and give you my maybe worthless opinion of what I would consider capital and what I would not, if that would help you in your ALG deliberations.
I'd appreciate that. What I'm hearing is that have a degree to which we're willing to go below the floor as outlined by Jason, below the free cash floor, and we would like to understand how much of the rest of that budget can be allocated reasonably to money that would come out of the stabilization fund. And there's just going to have to be some budget cutting, most likely, to close the gap. Does that sound correct?
I'd like to hear from a few more people on their opinion about softening the floor.
All right. Anyone?
I'll speak.
Please do.
We did talk about it a little bit last week, and I think there was a general consensus or opinion last week that we were all pretty much okay with softening that floor a little bit. And speaking for myself, I'm comfortable with that based on the fact that really that whole notion was set forth as a means to help the town protect their Moody's rating, right, or their bond rating. So it's really in the town management's best interest to try to maintain those levels. We're just here to kind of set recommendations. If the difference is 0.1% I don't see how it makes a massive difference. If it's 0.1% off of our recommendation, it's still pretty close to the targets that we've set, and it's a level that the town has to live with and that it has to work for the town's debt requirements.
Anyone else? From my perspective, I think we can argue whether we're in rainy days or not. We are clearly have in fiscal year 21 incurred emergency related expenses. And there is a question of how many more years this will be difficult in. But I think it is, if you're going to be flexible on a floor, now is the time for it. That said, we don't want to be too flexible because we also need to be fiscally prudent going forward. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, I don't want to reiterate a lot of the comments that were made, but philosophically, I tend to land in between Steve and Jason on this, and I do like the idea of sticking very closely to how this stabilization fund was pitched to town meeting several years ago, and I think as much as we can do that, that would be where my support would be. As far as the idea that this is like really tough times, I think there's a little sense of that, but to a large extent, obviously our tax dollars come in are heavily real estate based, and real estate market is extremely strong. I mean, something to consider is there could be stronger days, much more ahead of us on tax revenue coming in, just given the nature of the market in general and housing turnover and the valuations that you see out there. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but it's a lot different to say that we draw our tax dollars from much more of the service industry or the restaurant industry, et cetera. We're heavily residential real estate tax based, and that's been a lot more resilient. And obviously the town numbers show that as Mr. Barrett has presented to us. So my summation, I don't want to reiterate a lot of the points that were made, but I like the idea of adhering very closely to the idea that was pitched at town meeting about a stabilization fund and what it was used for. And I do like the idea of getting more specifics. And I don't want to get too cute about this, but line by line item is not the worst idea of going through this and understanding what can be mitigated with some cuts and what should be handled by a stabilization fund. But I think we've had a really good conversation and a very, very fulsome conversation on the matter. So I'll leave it at
that. Now, many of you have been around this block more than I have. As I mentioned, we are in an interesting position in that the school is going to have their final vote on their budget on March 18th, a week from this coming Thursday. And normally we would have ALG consensus on all of Acton's spending by that point in time. It sounds like we would like to see a lot more details on the Acton capital expenses in order to figure out how to handle that side of the budget, where it is funded from, whether we think it can be spent for out of the stabilization fund. It sounds like we don't think that simply closing the budget gap and paying the $1.15 million as listed in the ALG plan is the way to go, to paying for all of that out of free cash. So I don't know exactly where that leaves us in the ALG process, because we can go back whenever this next meeting is and say, we think you need to use the stabilization fund for some of it or cut budgets. But the schools are going to say, well, we need to vote on this tomorrow. So I don't know if, I'm hoping we can get input for some of you who've been doing this for longer, but do we want to at some point consider the two big budgets separately? Or do we want to go into the school committee vote without potentially having had a discussion on this? Or do we want to try to sum this all up in the next, set this all up at the next ALG meeting, which will not have given us time to go through the capital projects line by line? Christine.
So, not that I'm interested in having them do this, but if I understand correctly, even after the school has voted on their budget, they can reduce it. They can't increase it, but they can reduce it. So that deadline isn't necessarily something we have to be overly concerned about in that regard.
Okay. Any other guidance? Dave.
Yeah, just to that point, I would guess that would be only done under extraordinary situations. It's just a hunch. And we should go in there with our views solidified, is my sense is there probably won't be much wiggle room unless something dramatically changes between the two time periods.
Do you mean our view of the entire thing?
No, I just mean from the sense of the school budget being approved is thinking that it could be reduced. That might be a very high bar to do that, and I think that goes without saying. Is I would recommend we don't even consider that as a possibility. We should go in there with our opinion right now, or in the near term rather.
Did you want to say something, Jason?
I don't like the position we find ourselves in, where the school has been able to get to a final vote, and we just received the budget from the town 8 days ago. So this unusual year of having town meeting that late in the year and having almost no window for ALG to get to consensus does beg the question that we may very well not be able to get to consensus in time for town meeting this year. I fully understand that asking the school to go back after they've done their final vote is an incredibly large forklift thing to try and do. But the way I see things right now, we still have a $700,000 problem. And if we're going to recommend right now that $700,000 is going to have to come out of the budget that's 1/3 of the total spend, that puts the town, the municipal side, behind the 8 ball. I'm not convinced I want to do that yet, but I am sticking to my guns that we have a $700,000 problem, and I don't want it to just get pencil whipped off through free cash and stabilization. We have a recommendation for a reason. We've been told not to go below 3%. We've been told that can't possibly do that. Well, if that's true, then the budget has to be reduced. Or it's not true, and we should have been able to do tax relief along the way. And we should be allowed to look at all of the buckets of money as reserves. It's one or the other. It can't be both.
Christine.
I'd like to actually hear from Steve, if you don't mind, and then I'll go.
Steve.
Okay, so having ALG consensus this early in the game, although you think it's late, is a bit of a luxury. And maybe it was just me, because when I'm on ALG, we never, only 1 year did we ever actually get it done early. 1 year we went, it was the warrant printing deadline that drove us to consensus as opposed to anything else. So that's only 2 weeks before town meeting. So
to be fair, that's how it was last year, and then the pandemic changed everything.
Yeah. So has it ever occurred that the schools had to go back and lower their budgets? Yeah. It's not, it's a painful exercise for them. I wouldn't want to put them through it. Do we have to reach consensus in a matter of days? When are they taking their final vote?
March 18th.
Thursday.
A week from Thursday, March 18th.
Yeah. So you'll have another ALG meeting. We'll be closer. We may not have closed the $700,000 gap, but we'll be closer. Then it becomes a matter of where do we find the rest of the money? And so I wouldn't say you have to get there on Thursday.
But we're not meeting Thursday.
Well,
we're now looking at potentially only one ALG meeting before the school does their vote.
Well, that could be problematic then. But my advice is if consensus is staring you in the face, take it. it's better than not having it. But like I said, hopefully by the time you meet, we'll be a lot closer than $700,000. Gaps of $100,000 can mysteriously disappear at this stage in the ALG process. When you get a lot above that, it gets very hard. Very hard.
I think we're a fair amount above that still.
Well, I haven't told you what I think of the cap.
Christine.
Okay. Yeah, so that's my concern is we may only have one more ALG meeting to come to a real consensus, and I'm hearing mixed. We've got a subset of money somewhere between all of the 700,000 and none of the 700,000 that Steve is going to find very good reason to pay for out of stabilization. And given that he was part of setting it up, I would think he would be the excellent person to come up with that list. And Christy and I will have the information we need to sell that at ALG. And it's that remainder. The remainder we either tell them they cannot spend in our estimation, or we go below our floor, which is why I keep pushing for more details on how everybody feels about those two options, or when we're in the room and we have the information you've given us at this meeting today, you allow us to make a judgment call and do our best to satisfy all of the expressed feelings of the committee.
These budgets don't have a lot of flab in them, if any. So we're between a rock and a hard place on this. The 3%, we didn't make up that 3% floor. And we're going to have to live with our bond rating, John Montrati's plan calls for spending a lot of money over the next 10 years, some of it financed. I have an unsettling feeling in the back of my mind that Conant may have to be replaced in the next 10 years, So there's a lot of good reasons, a lot of good arguments on both sides. And getting to a middle ground is not going to be a simple thing. All I can say is, like I said, if an opportunity presents itself, I'd say go for it. We can only beat you up so bad, and Christy won't be chair next year. She's probably counting meetings at the moment.
Yeah. I reached that point last week.
for the rest of you who haven't been chair, Roland, Mike, Jason, I certainly know that there is a point in the FinCom season when the chair starts counting. How many more meetings do I have to do this? And
a little bit longer.
Why did I agree to do this? And I know I'll never do this again. Spoken as a multiple time chair of this committee, but I usually take a long time between.
Roland.
What Steve just said with Conant is absolutely viable. And then you look at Blanchard and other work that has to be done in the junior high and high school buildings, etc. Consensus is never easy with that, with ALG, as Jason can very well attest to, and so can Steve. Been there, done that type of thing. Just think to help close that gap. You have to really consider stabilization funds. And that's exactly what they're there for. $700,000 is still quite far apart. And I unless all of a sudden the schools comes up with some miraculous deal where they can, eliminated a lot of costs somehow. I just don't know. And it's finally having a 10-year capital plan, as John just pointed out, is something great. I mean, and it really helps lay out a roadmap of what should be addressed and being taken care of. And I think once we get through the first year of it, then they should be looking at 10 years beyond that. So it kind of gets added onto it. Every year, 1 year rolls off, another year rolls on, and keep the town updated as to what we've accomplished and what we'll maybe put off to another year or what have you. So it is fully transparent, and I'm sure John is working towards that. And I have every faith and confidence that he will do that. He's proven that so far, and I appreciate that. So, as Jason pointed out, it's awfully hard to say, okay, it's $700,000 we're apart, and it can't all come from the municipal side. That's obvious. So the schools have to do it. So they do a little bit of work and sharpen their pencil. I mean, why do they have to get it done by the 18th? We're not going to have town meeting until later in June.
Foxborough.
They have to do it because of Foxborough.
Well, I mean, so we have to have at least another meeting in between now and then to try to work out that $700,000.
If not, the town gets left holding the bag.
Yeah, and that can't happen, as we know. I mean, ultimately what happens is the taxpayer holds the bag. I mean, in all reality.
I think the taxpayer always holds the bag in this
That is
situation.
correct. No one holds the bag at all because we're the ones who are being the one who are being taxed.
Steve had a proposal way back when we were discussing our idea of the policy of saying that if we ever did go below the floor, we would not spend above the amount turned back in the previous year. Is that something we would like to consider here to indicate a bottom of our wiggle space? Christine, can you bring that up easily? Not that you need to show it, just can you find out what that number was? On the reserve tab, what turnbacks for the previous year was?
Reserve tab of ALG?
Yeah. Oh, that's a little strange to talk about this in a public forum. It feels like we're giving away our tactics.
Well, we have to do it by committee.
Yeah.
They have to see where we're coming from. I don't know what Christine found, but it sure looked confusing there.
It was just loading really slow and it didn't have any of the bottom tabs. And I'm like, where's the rest of this mammoth spreadsheet? Share this with you. Okay. Let me see if I can make this. All right. Is this showing you what you're looking for, Christy?
It's not there. You actually have to scroll down. We need to know what the turnbacks were, what was replenished. Okay, wait, back.
Now I've gone too far.
Oh, no, forward. We want to be under letter C.
C's not even on the screen.
It is. Line 37 says C, assumption of reserve replenishment.
I'm looking up here at these letters.
Oh,
great. Here you go. Here's C. I'm just going to stop.
So if I read that correctly, there was close to $1 million of turnbacks last year. Yeah, last year.
Yeah.
Am I reading it correctly?
Yes.
So by this logic, even if we were to use, we would not recommend the full $1.15 million of reserve use because it would violate this theory. it would not be, it's not even estimated to have that turned back next year.
And Jason's mind would explode if we got anywhere near this number.
Well, we're already at 700 something.
Not of reserve use, of a gap.
A gap.
No, of reserve use.
$468,000 plus. You're right. We're at $668,000 of reserve use in our proposed spending.
But still with a $700,000 gap.
Yes.
Still with a $700,000 gap. Exactly. Yes.
So if we, going back on something that's been brought up before in another context, if we estimated this year's turnbacks, which John said would not be near, last year, we could at least say there is some room to move beyond the $200,000 on healthcare related stuff. How much room there, don't know. But John did indicate there would be a turnback.
Yes, and at ALG, I think he indicated it would not be large. But there would be some.
I'm not saying it would be large. I'm just saying it might be enough to give us a little bit more flexibility. I'm torn between saying, yeah, we can penetrate the 3% floor in extraordinary circumstances as long as we can see it clear that we'll put it right back to where it was, which is what I would say we would do with turnbacks to the extent they come in. Right now, we're saying we'll penetrate the floor maybe by 200,000, and we'll have the turnback to put it back at the end of the year. Maybe there's a bit more flexibility there. Again, a lot's going to depend on how big the gap is when we're looking at it. But we've been talking about the spending side. You can also question some of the assumptions on the revenue side. There's always the overlay reserve. Do we always have to fund it? Is there a need to fund it to $700,000 every year? We never seem to get any more nursing revenue or meals tax revenue.
Have we pulled from the enterprise funds properly to cover their expenses so that we don't have quite as much in reserve in each of those buckets of money?
To the extent it is legal, and how it was funded, yeah, you can do a lot of things. It doesn't all have to be about cuts.
Yeah, I'm not prepared to sign off on this yet. I think we've done a lot of spending the last couple of years on wants, and I think it's coming home to roost. I'm sorry that it hurts, but we shouldn't have done those wants, and I'm not prepared to pay extra now.
How are you feeling, Christy? I feel like I have a sense of where everybody kind of is and that we can.
I think I have a sense for where people are. I'm curious to see whether we're going to be able to get consensus given potentially only one more meeting.
I look forward to Steve's stabilization numbers.
Okay. I may give you some other thoughts as well.
That would be most welcome. Everyone else, I've heard a whole lot from Steve and Jason and Roland and Christine. Sahana, is there anything you want to add into here?
No.
Mike, how are you feeling about potentially dipping below the 3% floor?
On a temporary basis, as long as we know we're going to put it right back, based on extraordinary times, I could live with it. I would go with consensus.
Isha, what are you thinking? And I understand if this is overwhelmingly too much right now.
I think I'm willing to be somewhat flexible, but I do have concerns long term about just spending beyond what we should be, as Jason pointed out. I think it's, and several others actually. So I think it's unsustainable, but I do also realize that it's a tough budget year overall. And we're trying to maybe try and achieve a lot of different things with different objectives. So let's see where we come out. As I said, I'm willing to be somewhat flexible, but then again, my vote really doesn't count. So it's just an opinion.
We're not making a motion right now, so your opinion counts fully.
Yeah. No, I think I appreciate all of the other opinions that people have voiced. I'm still learning, but I can see that this is not an insubstantial amount to try and reconcile.
Christine, would you sum up what you think we'll go there with?
I think that, we're looking at, from our perspective, a $703,000 gap, that Steve is going to list for us amounts that at least should fall under stabilization in a way that honors why stabilization was set up, and from David Martin's perspective, hopefully, at least, there's a good argument to be made that those funds should be taken out of stabilization, and there's going to be a number that is currently X that will be the gap. And our goal is to pay for that gap without dipping further into free cash. And some on the committee would prefer a hard line to not go any lower. And so we should do our best to not go any lower. But it's not necessarily the entire committee's position that we don't have some wiggle room if we are unsuccessful.
Does that sound right?
Yep.
And if we're, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, just one last thought is that it has been an extraordinary year, and just taking a 10,000-foot view of it all is certainly a stabilization fund, and I don't want to use the term rainy day fund, but these types of funds that are set aside for specific reasons have they have reasons to be used. That said, also sharpening your pencil, as we always talk about, and looking at your budgets and finding another way to find savings is another very reasonable approach. And it just, listening to the discussion and listening to the town manager, it sounds like there's been some approach of that, but I think, we should always be thinking about that, is how can we always save? And this is a year where, finding additional savings is certainly reasonable to do. And I think the town in general would appreciate, hearing some of that, and, meeting in the middle with something like this. I agree, it's not a hard and fast line, but if there's some sense of cost savings and some sense of reserve use, or, free cash use or whatever, then that's a good balance in the year that we just came out of. And I say this more as, philosophically, but it's easy to look at reserves and say, well, let's just use that, when I think this committee has discussed for months about how the average families, a lot of them are, pinching pennies and cutting corners and trying to find ways to save money. So we should be doing the same as well.
I think for me, a lot of my concern is that if we spend a lot of the free cash, it looks like it's very unlikely that it will be fully replenished. So we're looking at a problem of dipping too far below that floor will be setting us up poorly going into the next few years. Whereas the stabilization fund money, while it's harder to get at can help us smooth this sort of difficult time period. And yes, we're not in things have gotten super bad yet, but with this sort of free cash spending that we've been doing, we are heading to trouble. Does that sound right?
I agree.
Yes.
Okay. We will let you all know when ALG gets to rescheduled too, and if it's possible to get another meeting in, another ALG in before the school votes. We might see if we can schedule another one of these to hash it out, because I don't think we're going to reach consensus in one meeting without knowing how much work the school and the town would be doing at this point in time to try to help fill that space. I think they're waiting for us to come back and say our opinion on our recommendation to use stabilization fund based on the strong reaction at the last meeting. Anyone want to say anything else in there? Oh, I'm sorry. I want to, and unfortunately Jason left. Are we comfortable with the school, if it comes down to it, the school going to vote on their budget without us having reached consensus at ALG? I presume that means we still have a chance to reach consensus later on, but it puts the onus on the town to do the changing of their budgets.
I think this year it just is what it is.
Okay. Moving on to the next item of business, we have one set of minutes to review. Is that correct for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
I had been told there'd be a second set, but I don't think it ever came through. And these are the minutes. Adam, am I correct? It's December 22nd?
That's what I show.
Wonderful. We have found a few amendments. Sahana has in fact voted in the roll call votes. And neither Christine nor I have chosen to use Mr. as our honorific. I believe I might not be. I'm speaking for myself. I don't think Christine does. No. Okay. So we'll make those changes. Okay. Do we have a motion?
Approve the minutes of December 22nd as amended.
Second.
All right. We'll go do a vote. Adam.
Aye.
Steve.
Aye.
Christine.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Sahana.
Aye.
Roland.
Aye.
David.
Aye.
Isha.
Aye.
And I say aye. Wonderful. Minutes approved. We're up for committee reports now. Anyone have anything to share? I don't know if you all managed to attend it. The school committee budget meeting last Thursday was interesting. It was less painful than some. I think they did a good job compressing it down and really getting to the information they needed to. I certainly walked away thinking that it was a very well thought out and pared down budget. There is a hope of returning to regular school next year also. So the budget is based on that, with the caveat that goodness knows what will happen if that doesn't end up being the case. Dave?
Madam Chair, I look forward to April 5th.
What's on April 5th?
All your kids will go back to school.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, I have to say, honestly, I've been enjoying not having to do drop off and pick up every day. Roland.
Part of the meeting, and I saw JD's presentation on the Capitol. I thought that was very well presented. They talked about the plan and everything. I thought that was something that's it was good. I wish they put the power lines underground when they had the ground all opened up there and all that. But, you know, I put new poles in. It's like they were talking about the poles rotting out. Well, you put wooden phone poles in, they're going to rot out eventually too, and they have to be replaced. So it would be better if you could have buried those at that point and made the campus a little bit more aesthetically appealing. But I thought overall, it was a good presentation.
Not only do I wish Jason was here to hear you say that, but it reminds me that one of my daughters was discussing why haven't they put the lines underground? She said, I understand it's expensive, but they really should be doing it.
Hills put up in a lot better progress. They did that. And Jason did get a shout out from JD, so I thought that was pretty cool.
Start them young, Christy.
Oh, yeah. They like to watch us when they have the chance. Anyone else? Anything else to report on? Okay, Isha, I think we're ready for you to make a motion.
I motion that we adjourn this meeting.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Wonderful. We'll do a vote. Adam.
Aye.
Steve.
Aye.
Christine.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Sahana.
Aye.
Roland.
Aye.
Dave.
Aye.
Isha.
Aye.
And I say aye.